All right, here we go. We're into Deaf History Notes, Chapter 5. I'm hoping this one's going to be shorter than normal, but there is too much to do in this one. This is the chapter that has hours and hours of video to support it. And so I'm going to try to give you snippets so that you know when you... there's going to be a separate module in here. Let's go ahead and make it right now. Let's see. Links to instructional videos. Okay, so those are useful things, and that is getting expanded as we go. But let's go ahead and we're going to make another page, which is the what will we call this? DHN Unit 5 video folder. Video, not video. Okay. So it will have, I'm not going to do this all now, but it will have all of these videos and more. And I strongly recommend that you watch all of them. There isn't a video on the deaf community that I think is a waste of time, but these in particular have significant amount of information in them, help you understand the deaf community's perspective, and can inform you for useful information if you're ever interpreting down the line and somebody talks about these issues, then you're ready to go. Okay, so let's get started. And that means we bring the book up. Looks like that. So we're starting off with Dummy Hoy and deaf athletes. So we're talking about deaf organizations, socialization, deaf people doing for themselves. Thank you very much. And so we start off with deaf professional athletes. And there have been deaf people in basically every sport. Deaf swimmers in the Olympics, deaf gymnasts, deaf everything. So what we got here is William Hoy, who's lovingly known as Dummy Hoy. Back in the day, dumb meant mute, not stupid. And so to be Dummy Hoy meant that, oh yeah, he doesn't talk. Didn't mean he was an idiot. And so here's William Hoy. This is the picture you always see of William Hoy. And did he end up getting into the Hall of Fame yet? There's been an effort to get him in the Hall of Fame because, not that he had such an outstanding career, although he had a good career. He was a good player. So he's the most accomplished deaf player, and you say, well, there's not a lot of deaf players. Yeah, but he ended up still being a good player. So if you can read the record here. This is Wikipedia. And so, what do we got? Well, his claim to fame, and the reason that there's an effort to get him into the Baseball Hall of Fame, is that's not him. Is that he created the idea of raising one arm for a ball and the other arm for a strike. That's it. It's a simple thing, but it was a visual clue to help him understand the strategy of where are we in the count, how many balls of strikes are, balls for me, how many strikes against me, and so that was it. That's William Hoy's claim to fame and his contribution to sports in general. That's still in use today, although generally the strike is dramatically performed and the balls almost all have no signal dependence on the umpire. The other major contribution, at least the story goes, and probably there is truth to it, is that the football huddle, well, this article helps us to understand that football huddle was still unusual enough in the 1920s that it made fans at college games wonder what was going on. It led to complaints about the game being slowed down. What are you guys doing on the field? Get out there. Move the ball down the field. Blood makes the grass grow. And so the issue, though, was, other teams were, it was something teams were doing in the 20s. But apparently the first time, you have some record of it, 1918, 1924, but there's a record of it being used in the 1890s when the Gallaudet College quarterback, Paul Hubbard, this is not a picture of Paul Hubbard, this is a picture from the 40s, so I don't know who these people are, but they're Gallaudet players. Anyway, so he gathered them around gathered his players around. He had his offense form a tight circle so they could discuss plays without the other team seeing what they were signing, which we assume the other team knew some sign language. And so there you go. There's your claim to fame in sports. And the idea here is that sports is a fairly equal playing ground for deaf people. As long as you don't have to hear to compete in the sport, and if that can be compensated for, such as the starting gun of a race. Well, okay, or for swimming. So you just put a sensor on there that has a strobe light go off, and at the same time that the trigger is pulled for the start of the race, the strobe light goes off, visual clear, cue, auditory cue, everybody's on the same basis. Blind, deaf, and hearing people can all compete on the same terms. Okay, so great. So that's the idea. Athletics is something that deaf people can equally participate in, best hearing people out if they're a better athlete, and show that deaf people can do anything except hear. Deaf actors in silent films. Now, back in the day, you had silent films, which, because you didn't have a matching soundtrack to them, you didn't have to be a hearing person to be an actor in a silent film. Now, the majority of them were, but there were a few deaf actors that were in silent films. I don't remember. Well, Granville Redmond was one of them. And there's a great short little silent film where, I don't know if it's Granville's playing, so there's a deaf actor playing a butler who, the character, he actually is deaf. The actor is actually deaf. The character is pretending to be a deaf person, but the character is hearing. And so at the end, he's like talking with all the other people, but he's deaf. He's not actually talking with anybody, but it's a silent film, so what do you know? It's a great scene, and I should have thought to bring that up, but I'm not going to search for it right now. Okay. And so you had Charlie Chaplin, who worked with Granville Redmond, and so you have little vignettes of little pictures of Charlie Chaplin, at least I think saying D is the picture. Let me pull that up here, because that's right away in one of these. Oh, what happened to the rest of that? Must be in the other movie player. So let's see, Charles Crow. That's not the one. Ernest Marshall. That's the one.
From 1913 to 1928, while Marshall was going to school, the country was under the influence of the silent film era. Fanwood, like many deaf schools, frequently exposed its deaf students to movies featuring all the current stars. And the young student Marshall often went downtown to see the picture shows in the Great White Way. In those days, deaf people could easily understand the movies by reading the title cards. Some movies even had deaf performers. Here is Charlie Chaplin with deaf actor Granville Redmond in A Dog's Life. But it all came to an end in 1926 when Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer ushered in the era of the talkies. Almost overnight, deaf people were shut out of the popular entertainment medium. Desperately, they tried to search for ways to understand the talkies. Deaf newspapers printed synopses of popular films so that deaf people could at least follow along at the movies. On one occasion, they asked a hearing preacher to wear luminous gloves and interpret the movie in the dark theater. But nothing brought them back to the wonderful times of the silent film era until Marshall introduced movies in sign language. After Marshall's first movie, he began to experiment with his new medium. One problem faced by deaf directors was that American Sign Language movies were silent. A hearing person who didn't know sign language would never understand them. But Marshall came up with a clever idea. He put subtitles at the bottom of the screen. Then both deaf and hearing audiences could enjoy the films. His second movie, The Confession, combined sign language and subtitles for the first time. I want to show you a short segment from that movie. Another of Marshall's innovations concerned films of people signing songs. Today there are quite a few programs which feature songs interpreted in sign language, and several have won regional Emmys. Marshall not only created the medium, he went it one better.
I used to go to see the silents, and I was fascinated with how they would illustrate a song by bouncing a ball over the words. When someone was singing, you could follow the song by watching the ball. I thought that was an interesting idea, and that I could make something out of it for a sign language movie. So I found a song from this book, and I looked at it, and I found a special way to do a movie of the song sung in sign language.
Why this throbbing burden brave? Why this never and forever? Meets me when some good I'd gain flies beyond my best endeavor. Why this heart so thrilled with woe?
Okay, so you get the
Lips
idea.
can
So
taste.
we have Ernest Marshall. That's Ernest right there. And so he was an entertainer, magician, filmmaker. He basically, it's home movie stuff, but he put as much of a production quality to it as he could, with the idea of taking it around to deaf clubs around the country and showing it to audiences. And people would travel miles just to see a film that had sign language in it, because you didn't have many films that had sign language in it. Still don't. And so it's a bit of a rarity. There's the Ernest Marshall film. We're seeing all 30 minutes of this video. Okay, particularly this short. This is the whole movie is here. It's entertaining, but right about here.
You lose your soap. That's pretty careless of you.
Okay.
When he said he went out and bought some soap, I got suspicious. He wasn't telling us the truth.
So in this film, which I'm not at the right moment, this character who was just signs I. This one was made in 1960, before any signed English book was ever published. This is my evidence that the sign I is an ASL sign used by deaf people, and not only an invention of people who are trying to teach English. Not trying to teach English here, he's just using this sign. And so it's part of my argument that if deaf people do it, it's ASL. It's an ASL sign. Historically, we have video proof of it. Okay, you can find that on your own. Let's move on to, well, where did it go? Oh, Charles Crow. So Charles Crow is another person who made films. He made home movies. He wasn't making narratives. He was just basically kind of documenting life as it was in the 1930s and 40s, probably beyond, but that's what the films are here. This is Ted Sapala. Ted is basically the leading ASL historian. He's a linguist who uses these films of here's how signing was done. So you start with 1913 and the preservation of the sign language. And then whatever home films people have made, they were home films in his family. He has a deaf family, deaf parents, and deaf siblings. But anyway, so this was Charles Crow, and that's Charles Crow is the tall one there. And this is Yanzito. Was it Charles Yanzito? Were they both Charles? And together they did a lot of these kinds of films that they would just document the events of a deaf event and then show the video footage around deaf clubs. And people say, oh yeah, I know them, and so forth. Good to see them. And you didn't have Facebook. For that matter, you didn't really even have TV. So this is kind of an exciting thing to see, oh, what's the latest from the Chicago convention? I wasn't able to go. Let's see who was there. So what's the convention for? Well, this is also telling us about another organization that deaf people sponsored for themselves, and that is the Frat. So let me get to the Frat here. The National Fraternal Society of the Deaf, otherwise known as the Frat. It's an insurance agency. And the idea was that deaf people were being charged extra rates just because they were deaf, where they were just as good as drivers as anybody else. In fact, probably better. safer driver. And so they decided to insure themselves. What the heck? Why pay this extra premiums for these other companies? We can insure ourselves, and they did. And they were successful. And an extra bonus was, if you're a member of this insurance agency, they would have every 4 years a conference or convention. And you would go, just a fun thing to go to. Wow, there's a misspelling in there. I wonder if that got fixed before publication. Probably not. Okay, so let's look at this. There'll be a little bit mentioned about the frat. Maybe some imagery from a convention in this.
Got a job as a printer to support his family. He never married. He socialized a lot with deaf people and was a member of the frat. Charles met another deaf man who shared the same interests and hobbies. They became partners working on films. His partner's name was Charles Yanzito.
Then a man, Charles Yanzito, asked me to help him with his photography. Now, this wasn't movies. This was back in the days when there were no movies, just snapshots. He wanted me to explain how to develop photographs. When he had learned enough, I went back home, my obligation done. But he wasn't satisfied. After a week or two, he came back to my house, asked me to help him with his pictures. So for his sake, I went over and helped and explained to him again. You see, deaf people didn't use telephones back then. They would simply show up and hope someone was there, or just exchange letters. 2 or 3 weeks later, he'd show up again. He could not write letters, so he would have to come in person. I went over to help him. Then he would tell me, "Don't stay home alone. Come over anytime." So I went over every week for his sake. That's how it all started. Later, Yanzito saw a newspaper ad for movie cameras. He wanted to buy a camera.
In 1923, compact 16mm motion picture equipment was first made available for home use. Kodak invented a safety film stock which replaced the dangerously flammable nitrate film stock used in the industry. Bell & Howell was a leading manufacturer of small, portable movie cameras.
I took Yanzito downtown to this store called Bass. They understood deaf ways. They were willing to help and explain. So they advised Yanzito to buy a good camera made by Bell & Howell, and that's how all this filmmaking started. After the Denver convention, we made films of many different things: deaf people in Chicago, their parties, different gatherings, and social events. Now we were taking our camera out and shooting night and day. 3 or 4 years later, we started to travel. Yanzito had been poorly educated, so I would often have to explain different concepts to him. One day, I was talking with Charles about the weather. I told him down in Miami it's nice and warm. He didn't believe me, so I told him, yes, here in Chicago it's cold, but Miami is different. I explained how the sun changes its place in the sky, so Miami had more sunshine than Chicago in winter, so Chicago is dark and cold. Yanzito still doubted it, so I asked my boss for 1 week off, and he gave it to me. Both of us went and bought train tickets to Florida. His brother and my sister took us to the train station. We said our goodbyes, and then we were off to Miami on the train. Along the way, I pointed out things in the farmlands, like how the snow melts and everything is greener. I pointed out a tree and said, "See the evergreen tree? That's a pine tree. That's where turpentine comes from." He was a house painter, but he didn't know that turpentine came from a tree. We continued on, and our first stop was in St. Augustine, Florida, at the School for the Deaf and Blind.
The school was founded in 1885 by a deaf man named Thomas Hines Coleman. Coleman was a graduate of Gallaudet University. After graduation, he wrote the governor of Florida and asked for land so he could start a school for deaf and blind children. The state of Florida donated 5 acres, and the new school was started.
The administrator told us that the blind and deaf students were on separate halves of the campus. They weren't linked together, but kept separate. Classes for the deaf on one side, while those for the blind were on the other. We left northern Florida for Miami, and along the way we met many deaf people. Both Yanzito and I wanted to shoot film that our friends in Chicago could see later and enjoy. We felt that our home movies gave us an excellent opportunity to document deaf culture and our signed language. And of course, everybody wanted to be in our films. Filmmaking was so new back then. It opened up a whole new way of communicating.
Okay, so you get the idea. And this is also, we're seeing the entire half-hour video as well. So, deaf people in charge of themselves. We have little examples of the frat convention there. What was the other organization? So you graduate from Gallaudet, you start your own school. That was a common thing too. A lot of schools for the deaf were started by graduates of Gallaudet's college, the Gallaudet College. Okay, so what's our next challenge here? Back to entertainment. So let's go to the National Theater of the Deaf, and a lot of the original members of the National Theater of the Deaf are in the segment I'm about to play. Here we go. This is My Third Eye. This is your first video that you have a film review for. This is probably the most controversial part of it, where you see hearing people paraded and portrayed as freaks. And quite frankly, the deaf community often ends up being a freak. You know, oh, even though they can't hear, look at the work they can do. Yeah, that didn't have anything to do with the work that they could do. So here, let's take a look at this.
Here is the exhibit. See? Yourselves. Body shape the same. Limbs the same. Behavior different. You and I use our eyes. Hers are blank, weak. You and I use our faces.
Okay, sorry. I just wanted to point out who we're seeing here. Who are these members of the National Theater of the Deaf as we go through? So there's Mary Beth Miller. Okay. This is Ed Waterstreet, who we're going to see in just a little bit in another video. Joseph Saki. Not all of them are famous. And then this guy. And then this is, oh goodness, I can't think of her name. But you see her in a lot of the Signing Naturally videos in the Signing Naturally Unit 2 videos. There's Pat Grable, and Pat Grable's 80th birthday is coming up this week. And there's Bernard Bragg, who recently died. But these two are original founders of the National Theater of the Deaf. And Bernard Bragg was one of the better known deaf actors of, not that there's a nationally known deaf actor prior to Marty Matlin, but he was one of the premier deaf people in acting, had been on television, his own local television show that they had, which I haven't seen an episode of it. I don't know if there are episodes that are available to see. Anyway, so, and then we have, as our host here, this is Linda Bove. And Linda was on Sesame Street back in the 70s as a regular character for a season or two. And she's been in various made-for-TV films and so forth.
Hers is frozen except around the mouth.
So notice that we have all of the female voices are portrayed by this member of the troupe. So she's a hearing member of the National Theater of the Deaf. And to her back is the guy who voices all the men's parts. And I don't know their names, but they're credited in the film.
You will notice that the mouths will continue to move throughout this performance. Hands limp, soft, not used much. Why? Because they are not used for communication. Mouth opens and shuts, throat trembles, tongue wags, air is emitted, head cocks. We saw and found that these people make signs with their mouths. Let our actors show you.
Okay, so you're going to watch this whole thing later. It's a separate assignment to deal with. But that's National Theater of the Deaf. And so it wasn't actually founded by deaf people, but it was pretty good and close enough. Its early days had some mixed reviews from deaf people. They tended to sign in a more English-based rather than natural signing approach. A lot of things were written. Their translations were a little too close to the original. and therefore you saw portrayals by deaf people, but the signing itself might not have been as visual or as spatial as you would hope, but linear in its production. Nonetheless, deaf people playing the roles of deaf people. That was kind of an opening piece there for opportunities for deaf people as actors. You could actually earn a living as an actor. So let's see, at Ernest Marshall, National Theatre of the Deaf, and you can read about Eugene Bergman and the play Tales from a Club Room. And then we have the world-changing, essentially, Children of a Lesser God, which was a play that starred a deaf woman and featured the deaf community and the deaf culture. And so it was on Broadway for a number of years. Phyllis Freelich won the Tony Award for Best Lead Actress, and Marlee Matlin would win the Oscar Award for playing the same character years later. And so, let's see. Let's start with a clip I have from the film. Here's Marlee Matlin giving it to William Hurt. Now, okay, so the interesting thing about the Broadway show and the movie is that you have this main actor in the show voicing all of the dialogue with him. So it sounds like a monologue, but it's his lines he signs and speaks at the same time, and her lines he voices to himself, which is kind of a bizarre pattern. I wouldn't expect that to be the case unless you're really needy of hearing sound in order to understand, so you could voice for yourself, I guess. Anyway, it's an interesting technique. It worked for the film and it worked for the Broadway show. So here we go back to the...
Yeah? What have you just decided? No one's ever going to speak for you again? Come on. How are you going to manage? Everyone's always told me who I am. And I let them. She wants, she thinks. And most of the time they were wrong. They had no idea what I said, wanted, thought. And now they will. Well, that's all right. No, I'll buy that. No, I won't. How could I? Because I love you. Love has nothing to do with it? That's wonderful. Then what the hell have we been doing? Watch your hands. It's hard to avoid them. This sign. To connect. Simple. But it means so much more when I do this. Now it means to be joined in a relationship, separate but one. That's what I want. But you think for me, think for Sarah, as though there were no I. She will be with me. Quit her job, learn how to play poker, leave Oren's party, learn how to speak. That's all you, not me.
Okay, so there we go. That's the role that Phyllis Freelich originated. Marlee Matlin continued, and Marlee Matlin won the Oscar Award. Looks something like this.
The nominees for performance.
Yes, her co-actor, her co-star, is announcing the award winner. Of course, she's going to win, so it's kind of just an odd thing. At the time, they were dating. That didn't last very long. Bizarrely enough, he would be nominated the next year when she would present the awards, but he didn't win that year. He obviously had won the previous year. So in the Oscar, the male winner announces the female winner the next year. The female winner announces the male winner the next year. And so it looked like it could have been a tag team. He announced her win. She announced his nomination, but he didn't win. So, there we go.
Now,
oh, come on, play.
Actress in a leading role are Jane Fonda in The Morning After. Sissy Spacek in Crimes of the Heart. Kathleen Turner and Peggy Sue Got Married. Marley Matlin and Children of a Lesser God. Sigourney Weaver and Aliens.
Okay, that's some pretty tough competition. Those are all big names. I'm not sure if they've all won Oscars, but they all deserved Oscars at some point. So, and then of course you know who won. But of course he gets to sign her name at the point that he announces her name.
And the winner is Marley Matlin.
Okay, so everybody in the whole room is thinking, "Oh yeah, it's the pity award. She didn't really deserve it," and I don't know if she deserved it or not compared to the other performances. You know, it was a good performance. It wasn't a stellar performance. She has more stellar performances later in her career. However, let's see, are we going to be able to see Jack? So this is our first time that I hear the person who will be person who will be expressing her thoughts in English for the next, when was this, 87? So we're now 40 years. Has it been 40 years? No, 30? Okay, so we're 32 years into a relationship between Marty Matlin and her interpreter, Jack Jason. So here we get to hear Jack Jason's voice as Marty signs. Okay, all right, folks. Sit down. Let's move on.
I just want to thank a lot of people. To tell you the truth, I didn't prepare for this speech, but I definitely want to thank the Academy and its members. And I want to thank all those special people in the film, and I can name them: Randa Haynes, Patrick Palmer, the entire cast and crew, and particularly William Hurt, for his great support and love in this film. And I want to thank my mother and father, Eric, Mark, Gloria, Zachary, and Liz. They're here tonight with me. And I just want to thank all of you. I love you.
All right, thanks, Jack. Yay, Jack Jason. Okay, and then a year later, she announces the award and does something very controversial. So let's look at that amazingly controversial moment.
It truly is an honor to be back here this evening to share with you this wonderful moment. Acting, which comes from the heart, deserves recognition. As actors, we strive for it. By nominating the following actors for Best Performance in a Leading Role, you have honored each one magnificently.
The nominees for Best Actor in a Motion Picture are...
Oh my goodness, she spoke. She spoke on national TV. How could she do that to the deaf population? How could she do that to her deaf community? Because she can, and not all deaf people are silent, and she's a very strong person, and she was adamant that she wanted to do it. She went to speech training to be, clear up, make sure it could be the cleanest possible. And she kind of wanted to audition for other roles, saying, I can speak. You don't have to put me in all deaf, all silent, all mute roles. So even though it kind of pissed off the deaf community, and they were upset with her for a good number of years, they got over it once most of her portrayals of deaf people are parallel to their own experiences, and the talking is not the majority of what she does.
William Hurt in protest music. Michael Douglas in Wall Street. Robin Williams in Good Morning Vietnam. Marcello Mastroianni in Dog Eyes. Josh Nicholson in Iron Reed. And the winner is, let's see, Michael Douglas in Wall Street.
Yay, Michael Douglas wins. Okay. So there we go. So Michael Douglas wins. And Marty Matlin did the amazing, unforeseeable, nearly unforgivable thing. She spoke when she's a deaf person, and she misportrayed the deaf community, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Moving on to other accomplishments that the deaf community has, we have CSUN, NTID, and that's just bothering me. Just go ahead and fix it, even though this isn't the base copy. Okay. Well, we already had Gallaudet, you see. So what's the deal with CSUN? CSUN, that's how you pronounce it, but what is it? It's the California State University at Northridge, which is a suburb of Los Angeles. So that's a California-funded institution where there is programs, interpreting program, and you can go to college there, and you can get a degree in deaf studies and some few other deaf-related things where your program might not need an interpreter. But the main thing was they provided interpreting. There was a program where you could get a college degree as a deaf person in California, and they would provide interpreters there. That instead of hiring your own interpreter at your own college, the state would fund the services, and you could get your degree there. NTID, funded by the federal government, technical college. The idea was Gallaudet's a liberal arts college where the deaf people who want to be engineers and do technical studies, mathematics, science, and so forth, where's their college at? And so the idea was that the federal government would house a program for deaf people at an existing technical college. A number of schools competed for that award, including the Rochester Institute of Technology, and they were the ones that won. And it's been there ever since. I mean, theoretically, it could be moved at any time. There's so much infrastructure that's been built and so much money that's been spent there that the chances of that ever happening are pretty slim. And so there you go. So at Gallaudet, you can go through an entire degree, in fact, most of the degrees, without ever having an interpreter, at least not for you. Well, the interpreters are for both parties. Maybe you would have a guest instructor who's substituting. And, oh gosh, I'll see green tea tonight. And so you might have an interpreter on occasion, but the idea is that it's entirely possible that you could get your entire degree without ever having an interpreter for your classes. At NTID and CSUN, you're going to have a limited choice of degrees that could happen, but largely you're going to have interpreting services for whatever degree you wanted to pursue otherwise. And so that's the idea there for those two schools. And that takes us up to Section 2. Although I do have a few other things I wanted to show you. Let me just make sure I don't have any other things lingering out here. Okay, so we have Love is Never Silent is the first made-for-television movie with deaf people playing deaf characters in every instance. I think that was its claim to fame. Also had a deaf director. And this is where we see Phyllis Freelick, the winner of the Tony Award for the Marlee Matlin role. So she has a major role in this production. So you'll see this. Here's a little bit of it. Sorry, that was Ed Waterstreet. He was one of the founding members of NTID, not NTID, National Theatre of the Deaf, in that skit we saw. course, Lutheran. Juliana Field. No, that's the director or producer. Sorry, the deaf producer of this video, not the director. And now Phyllis gets to do her part.
Wait, she has something else to say. On paydays, I always brought my daughter with me. She's hearing.
This is Lou Fant. Okay, Lou's been dead for a couple of decades now, but Lou was a major. He was also a founding member of the National Theatre of the Deaf. Yeah, pretty sure he was a founding member. And so he's hearing. He's a coda. His parents were deaf, and he's the author of one of my favorite ASL dictionaries, the ASL phrase book, and a significant interpreter, educator, and good guy all around. Plus, a lot of instructional videos that my kids grew up watching had him as one of the 4 or 5 narrators and characters in the stories that were there. So that's Lou Fant, Screen Actor Guild member, right? And he's in the movie, and here he's voicing, or he's expressing, the thoughts that Phyllis Freelick is expressing.
She spoke my words, and she was my ears. She was a little girl. Sometimes when there were big problems, she would fight for me. Always stuck in between. My Margaret. And soon, she'll be moving with her family away from here. And I'm very happy for her. No more between the world and Mama. There have been many changes, good changes. Hearing and deaf must learn to live together, learn together, and change together. I can tell you the deaf side, and even though we're deaf and cannot hear the rain falling, we still listen with our eyes. Hearing people have eyes in their ears. Deaf have ears in their eyes, and they can see the water falling. Silence, for us, is never silent. Please understand, we are listening always with our eyes.
Okay, so there you go. Love is Never Silent, the kind of big speech there at the end. It's a tearjerker, and it's an hour and a half or more. Well, an hour and 40 minutes. Great. It's got a lot of factual representations of things that the deaf community went through. One of the quotes that I have at the beginning is where Margaret tells her younger brother, Mama says no signing in the street. Put your hands in your pockets. Mama says no signing in the street. So that's a representation of oralism and internalized oppression. Okay, and okay, so we got that. Then we have a more modern exposure to sign language in Star Trek episode. We have this portrayal here. This is Howie Seago coming up.
How did this happen?
A total surprise. Apparently, a member of one of the factions didn't like the idea of peace.
I don't understand what you're trying to say, Counselor.
Okay, this isn't where I thought I'd left off. So I thought we were going to have Data learn. Here we go.
We will be unable to keep the Solari from destroying themselves.
How's it going? I will make 5 distinct forms of signing. I will learn them all.
Huh?
Computer, show me gestural language, designation M9.
Well,
very interesting. Technique of communication that is both silent and covert. It could be very useful.
Yeah, it is.
The use of gestures and hand signals predates the spoken word in most cultures.
Okay.
The major exception being the Layrons of Malchus.
Yeah, whatever. You're making it up. Okay, and then we have this beautiful little scene here.
In oneself, it can't easily be given by another.
Okay. Huh. You're right, of course.
You're right, of course.
Yes, I've seen this before.
Captain, I have reviewed and stored 5 distinct signing languages. Here's an example of the first. This is blue. This is the blue ocean. This is the blue ocean at sunset. This is 2 people walking along the beach by the blue ocean at sunset. This is 2 happy people in love walking along the beach by the blue ocean at sunset. This is 2
I don't believe it. Let's go talk to Reba.
Let's talk to Reba.
All right. And then we get this bizarre scene where...
Reba.
Well, okay. You're going to see for yourself.
Reba, Commander Data has learned your sign language.
He doesn't know that.
Talk to us.
It was my fault.
Uh-huh.
I am responsible for their deaths.
Wait, he hasn't said that...
In my arrogance, I thought no one could possibly harm the great Reba.
So, of course, Brent Spiner is reading the script, or has memorized the script. He's just a little bit ahead of where Hamasiko is at times. And so it's an interesting arrangement here. But it's a major role, deaf character on Star Trek. 1990s. Okay. And how he was on Broadway for a show. I don't remember the title of it. An interesting portrayal of, I think, a standard... Anyway, look him up. That's the Star Trek thing. That is the more famous piece here. Okay, I've got 2 pieces left to go. 2 pieces of video to go, making sure I don't have any more lined up. So, the idea that deaf people and music. Yes, deaf people and music. So here's an example of sign mark. I could also show you a few others. Rap tends to be a popular approach because you don't have to be on pitch. But there are deaf musicians who sing, sometimes winning America's Got Talent performance, elements and so forth. So here we go with sign mark.
The whole world watching me. I stare back, take action, nobody stopping me. D is for desire, fire burns so heavily. My heart pumps rhythm, my soul is the melody. I came a long way, gave it my all. I know y'all quick with the criticism, y'all wait on my fall. I can't hear what you say to me when only supportive words come from a fortune cookie. People fear what they can't comprehend. The deaf man paints lyrics in the air by waving his hands. Ken, what's next, right? Who is so blind where your mind is sharp as a butter knife? It's not just music, more like a movement. You call it a joke, but we steadily proving there ain't no limit to what dreams can do. You can do more with what life hands you.
Just let your soul be a speaker box. Yeah, you get the keys right in your hand. Open the locks and do your thing. Let your soul be a speaker box. There's a beat in your heart. You'll find a way to make it clear.
Okay, so you're wondering, so whose music? So sign mark, and I forget his actual name, but that's how he trademarks himself. He wrote the music. I mean, he wrote the lyrics anyway. I'm not sure about how much of the music he created, but probably he wrote the music too. So he performed it in sign, he wrote the English lyrics, and he's assigned other performers to sing or rap those lyrics rather than him speaking himself. If you're going to look at Sean Forbes, oh, what the heck, let's just take a quick look at Sean Forbes. Scene Forbes, and let's do the one with Marty Matlin. We might as well. Whoops. Scene Forbes. Marty. Okay, there it is. Let's mambo. Of course, Marty Matlin had been on Dancing with the Stars, so she actually knew how to mambo. Here we go. And let's just jump into the middle of it.
We live in strange times.
Yeah, whatever. Can we not do that? All right, here we go. This is just another song.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Told you that you're my girl, and I live in your world. Things I said yesterday came back to bite me today. I be stick to it, need something strong to get through it. Cha 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 cha. College bed, night and dawn, I can walk and chew you gone. Some people call this fun. Can't wait to be done. Can't wait to be done. Can't wait to mambo. I can't mambo. Let's tango. I can't tango. Let's rumba. I can't rumba.
Okay, so there you go. It's a full-fledged video, and that is actually Sean Forbes' voice there. His parents were in the music industry, so that kind of helped. And he knew Eminem early on in his career. Not in, well, maybe in Eminem's career for that matter. Doesn't matter. Entertainment, deaf people doing it for themselves. Yes, it all happens. Okay, we're going to come back to DPN as soon as we cover some basics here. We got some legislation that helps deaf people achieve their goals. The biggest first one that came into play was in 1973 during the Nixon administration. We have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And that says if you're receiving federal funds, and then, you know, people figured out, well, that includes, I don't know, libraries and hospitals and, well, I don't know, a whole bunch of schools, then you have to have the programs accessible to disabled people, and that includes deaf people. And then later on, during Ford's administration, you have Public Law 94-142, otherwise known as the Individuals with Handicaps. And what is it? Education of All Handicapped Children Act. Yeah, there we go. So Section 504, that basically had the same requirements that the Americans with Disabilities Act would later have, but it only applied to federal organizations, or essentially federal organizations and then people accepting federal funds. Education of All Handicapped Children Act basically said you can't have a separate school as the only solution. If parents don't want to use a separate school for the child in a wheelchair, they should have the right to go to their local school, and that means schools have to make them buildings accessible. If it's a multi-story building, you need to have an elevator, or you need to have reasonable accommodation in some way that the stuff that they would be able to only access on the second floor becomes available to them on the main floor. But largely you have to have ramps and elevators, and a lot of school buildings got redesigned after that, after 1975. The biggest thing that you're seeing, though, is this phrase, this guiding principle of the least restrictive environment. Unfortunately, it wasn't the most enabling environment, because for a deaf child, the most enabling environment for their education would be a school for the deaf. Why is that? Because everybody in the school knows sign language. Like the secretaries, the janitors, everybody should know sign language, should not find it odd to use sign language. Whereas you go put the deaf kid in a mainstream school, sorry folks, extra yawn on this one today, yeah, then they're probably the only one besides their interpreter, maybe the teacher of the deaf, and I really do mean maybe teacher of the deaf, knows sign language. So PL 94-142 is positive and negative. It's kind of a, well, it's basis of a lot of schools for the deaf closing, which is not a good thing, because that's the heritage and culture of the deaf community. That's a great place for deaf people to be employed, and it's also a great place for deaf people to learn and not have any barriers in their learning. And then you put them into an environment where they have to have accommodations made 24/7 for at least all the time that they're there. Okay, and now we finally get to Deaf President Now. Now, this is 2 hours of video that is worth seeing, and I'm probably going to have to generate a narrated version, which will make it about 2.5 hours, because this reveals a lot of very interesting things about the deaf community without scripts or planning. It just happens, and you can see over and over again. The biggest thing is that deaf people will decide as a group what to do and how to do it, and they don't depend on individual leaders to tell them what to do. The leaders may reiterate what the community has decided. That's great, but the community doesn't decide just because a leader has said, here's what we're going to do. And so we start with the rally. And that's okay. So the Deaf President Now, the rally, Tuesday, March 1st, 1988. Why is that important? Because there would not have been a Deaf President Now movement had there not been a rally, had there not been an educational opportunity. I was a faculty member at that time. I was teaching English courses to freshman and pre-freshman students. And I had asked my students ahead of time, before this rally, what do you think about the deaf, we're going to get a new president. There are people who say we should have a deaf president. What do you think about that? And I didn't have a lot of people who thought that we needed to have a deaf president, because to them the president was just somebody who showed up on TV for their State of the University address every month. They had that little, he had a little blurb or something. He signed and spoke at the same time. It wasn't very interesting, and who cares about the president anyway? I mean, that's not athletics, that's not your education. You don't take any courses from the president. He just gives you a diploma at the end, big deal. After this rally, I only had one student who thought we should not, that we didn't need to have a deaf president. Everybody else had had an education and had understood that this is significant, that having a person who is deaf in charge of a school that is deaf says, hello, the school actually works. There's a point to this education. We're not just doing it to keep them busy for 4 years. This is something that actually contributes to your general welfare, your understanding of the world, and your ability to succeed and work as a professional. And so there's value in having a deaf president. And the one person who didn't think that we needed to have a deaf president had not been at the rally. Everybody else had been. So that made a difference. So, okay, so here we are. We're at the football field. We got some signs and posters. We got some big people here, famous people. So we got Bernard Bragg. We've got Clayton Valley. We've got Paul Singleton, who I don't know that he had any claim to fame at that point. Jacques Levesque. We have the brand new, in fact, I think on that day he became the president of the student body government, Greg Kleibach. We have Roz Rosen, who was president of the National Association of the Deaf. Fred Weinstein. We have, there's Milo Garcia. He created a lot of the signs. He was my office mate. And if anybody knows what's happened to Milo Garcia, please let me know, because I would love to get in touch with him again. It's been years. And then we got Harvey Goldstein, and we got Harvey, the math teacher, professor. But the thing is, we moved from the football field to the elementary school for the deaf. There's James Tucker. He was my co-teacher of English and great educator of my personal exploration of the deaf community. Okay, so you're seeing all these great images, and that was just the rally. Okay, and so we end up at the statue. This is Yerker Anderson, sociology teacher, and at that time president of the World Federation of the Deaf. A lot of Gallaudet folks end up being national and internationally famous people in the deaf community. So we moved around campus. We learned from a variety of speakers. More than 24 different speakers addressed the group. And from positions of authority and power, here are successful deaf people, many of them with PhDs themselves, many of them professors at the school. In fact, almost everybody who spoke was a tenured professor.
Required a government dialogue to be used.
Okay, and so then we end up at the statue of Edward Miner Gallaudet. Where is the statue of Edward Miner Gallaudet? We're going to see it in just a second. And the point is, Edward Miner Gallaudet, the first president of Gallaudet, was a native signer. He was a coda. And we hadn't had, I don't think we hadn't had a native signer since him. And we certainly hadn't had a deaf president at all, because Edward wasn't deaf. So here's Edward Miner Gallaudet. Here's Barbara Jean Wood, who at the time was the commissioner of the deaf in Massachusetts. Here's Gary Olson, who at the time was the executive director of the National Association of the Deaf. And these are all very short segments because my battery was running down at this point, and it kept cutting out. And here's Clayton Valley, ASL poet, and also would later be, I would be his graduate assistant later in life. And that's where my video imagery ends for the rally. So that's 23 minutes of imagery there. I encourage you to, because you'll get educated as to why we need a deaf president too in the process. And then at this point we have a few days before the Board of Trustees makes their decision about choosing the president. And the protest, well, it's not a protest yet because they haven't made their decision, right? We only protest their decision if they did choose the wrong way. But you have people explaining, here's, got some signs saying there's reasons why we need a deaf president, and we're in support of it. Yeehaw, so say all of us. and it was even, we had tents out there for overnight vigils. You had a rainy weekend. As you can see, they've got some plastic sheets up there to try to keep the folks dry. Honk for deaf president now. Yeah, but if I honk, how are you going to hear it? Okay, I guess it could be, hard of hearing. You can hear horn honks. Let's see. This guy. No, we just missed him. In the Children of a Lesser God movie, here we go. This guy right here is an actor in the film, and he's the one who says to William Hurt, "I don't think you're an asshole anymore. I think you're a dick brain." Of course, William Hurt's the speech teacher, says, "Good speech. I got it on the first go. You didn't have to repeat yourself." And so there we go. We're all in charge of. We're all here to say, and here's that same actor guy again.
We will ask Congress to amend the charter of the Gallagher University.
Okay, so this is Roz Rosen's son, Mr. Rosen. Damn, what's his first name? And Jeff Rosen. And he's an attorney, and he's kind of been explaining, because he's got intelligible speech, so he's talking to the person from the news broadcast on Sunday night. They've announced that Gallaudet Board of Trustees has chosen for the first time a woman as president of Gallaudet University. Let's all welcome Elizabeth Ann Zinser as the 8th president of Gallaudet University. Well, there wasn't a lot of welcoming going on campus. So here's Gary Olson again, NAD chief executive. He would play a major role here. Here's Jerry Covell, and he's just a guy. He's just a student, but he's a loud advocate. And here he is on the wall, the sandstone wall of Gallaudet, telling people, "Meet me in Hughes Gym right now. Let's go." Okay, I'm going backwards. Let's go forward. Right. Meet me in Hughes Gym right now. Over that way. Let's go. Over there. Anybody? Hello? Bueller? Okay, so nobody moves. And this is a part of my examples of the deaf community moves as a group. And right now, James Tucker is saying, "Hang on, stay here, stay overnight. We've got, the police are directing traffic." We're in the middle of the street. This is outside of Gallaudet. You're on 8th Street and 8th and K. Florida Avenue. Sorry, Florida Avenue at basically at 8th and K. You're there. Not all streets go straight. And so, they go straight, but they don't all go parallel. And anyway, you get the idea that we're out in the street. Police are directing us to go, directing traffic to go around us so they don't run us over. And we're trying to figure out what to do. What do we do? And we're having a conversation. It takes a good half hour of conversing to figure out what to do. And somebody says, "You know what? Board of Trustees is still in town. They haven't left. They had their vote, but they're still meeting. They're in the Mayflower Hotel downtown." Oh, okay. Well, we should go take our protest to them, because while we're here, nobody is paying attention to us. But maybe if we went down there, okay, good idea. Let's move. Discuss it for a while, and then as a group, people say, "Okay, look, you got all your leadership standing up here. You got Gary Olson, and you got Jerry Covell, and you got other people who have addressed the crowd are all in unison saying we should all do this." And you can see that some people are starting to move, and so now we are going to walk. Don't run. Stay on the sidewalk. Be safe. We're peaceful. Don't do any damage. We're going to walk to the Mayflower Hotel, which is all great, except none of us know the address of the Mayflower Hotel or exactly how to get there. So, as it turns out, we're walking down the street. We're kind of excited and filled with energy, and some idiot's throwing firecrackers here. Oh, that won't make the police a little edgy. And we're approaching where they're directing traffic around us. And they turn around and say, "Wait a minute, why are you guys coming? Where are you guys going?" So they're trying to get us not to, go elsewhere. Stay where you are. You can sit down and protest there. We're directing traffic around. We're helping you out here. No. We're on a mission. We're going to the Mayflower Hotel, but we're not going to tell you that right now because we're deaf and you're hearing, and you didn't ask us in a way that we understand, and we're just kind of nervous that you're going to stop us. So let's get running. Let's panic, everybody. Time to panic. Okay, let's speed this up. And wow. So we get down here And there is, whoops, let's go back and see John. This is John Moser, also known as Super Duffy. He's got his own acting business now. There's John. You've seen him in your Signing Naturally videos. He's a deaf actor out in California, and he was a major player at Deaf President Now. I don't think I have video footage of this. He's brilliant. He had intelligible speech, so he was talking to the police officer at one point. He was getting us to slow down. Don't stop running. Let's stay together. There's no point in us running here and being, haphazard. We need to stay as a group. We need to get to the same place. And so he's leading the group towards the Mayflower Hotel, but none of us know where the Mayflower Hotel is. I know it's downtown D.C., but that's a big space. So he goes up to a police car, and he says, essentially, "Hey, could you tell me where the Mayflower Hotel is?" And the police officer does. And so why would the police officer do that? Because we're going to go there anyway. So might as well give us the quickest direct path to get there so we don't, trample anybody else's flowers on the way there. And he gets on his radio and says, they're going to the Mayflower Hotel. So now, finally, the police have some ideas of what we're doing. And, of course, they may or may not know that we're trying to talk to the Board of Trustees when we get there. So this is just outside the Mayflower Hotel. John's trying to get us to slow down, stay with one mind, one heart, one spirit. And Deaf President Now. Deaf President Now. Deaf President, okay. We get closer. There are little squad cars and stuff going down there. There's about 500 people. Good luck with that little paddy wagon. But we're not violent. We're just hanging out. Here's the marquee at the one side of the hotel, and they're saying, back away from the doors. We can comply with that. We don't need to pile up against the doors and make it a fire hazard. We'll as long as we're not going to get run over in the street, we will occupy the street. And then this guy gets up, where I don't know if I ever knew his name. He says, there's a door over on the side. We can get in the door and we can go on up to the Board of Trustees. I shouldn't portray him as being so dorky sound. And Jerry Covell says, no, we stay here in one voice, get down. Get down. Okay, all right, I'm done. All right. And so the point was, we are going to send representatives to the Board of Trustees and communicate with them. We're not here to shout at them. We want the decision changed. We want to explain our viewpoint. We'd like to have a conversation. Just happens to be 500 people in the street here while we're having this conversation. So you can see that Paul Singleton is there. Here's Paul. We have, I don't know who that is. We have Jerry Covell. We have Greg Kleibach, President of Student Body Government. We have Tim Raris, the immediately outgoing President of Student Body Government. You have a leadership team in place, but it's spontaneously put together. There's Dr. Madsen, who's the author of a sign language book that we don't end up using, Conversational ASL, but he's the School of Communication. And you've got people with PhDs, tenured faculty members are down here as well as the students. It's a joint effort. We are with you, behind you 100%. We are here united as a team, and we don't want you to ever give up. Don't give up. Okay, so you get the idea that we're here together, and we don't. I don't see Jane Bassett Spillman that night. There's film footage of her showing up, but that was long after this. Very early in the morning, about 6 o'clock in the morning, I show up at Gallaudet's campus to this. Cars blocking all the entrances to the campus. There are 6 or 8 entrances, and every single one had a vehicular blockade preventing anybody coming in or out of the campus. Maybe not the safest thing, because the people who owned the cars weren't necessarily near where their cars were. But they had also parked intelligently. They haphazardly, they parked in a way that you couldn't get a tow truck in to pull the cars out. And eventually that got cleaned out, and I never saw anybody maneuvering the cars. At this point, Greg is asking for cooperation. We're going to have the Board of Trustees come in for conversation. We'd like you to have them, let them come in. And so he has to repeat his message quite a few times. He's explaining what's going on, right? And all kinds of exciting stuff, which I want you to see, and I want to tell you more about it separately. We have faculty and a staff meeting. The staff meeting was a unique occurrence. They Then you have the final march on Friday, which is the night after Elizabeth Sensor has resigned, but we don't have deaf president yet. And then you don't see what happens to resolve the issues, but on Saturday you have a get-together. People are just hanging out, chilling, getting some burgers off of the Barbie and stuff like that. Right. And then, I don't even think I have any footage of that. On Sunday, March 13th, the celebrations take place. The deaf president has been chosen. And then we have a celebration afterwards. So I don't have footage of those things, but those are the landmarks of those screens there. There is footage available in the Deaf President Now Deaf Mosaic video. You really need to see all of this stuff. And the point is, the footage that I have here is, you know, in the field footage from the people who are doing it, not reporting on it from an outside perspective. And here's Irving King Jordan, making his announcement and thanking people and so forth. And this is the only time that I know of seeing him sign without voicing for himself. That he's depending on the interpreter to express his thoughts in English. There we go. That is the shortest overview of this video I've ever done. It's an hour? Well, it's 2 hours. It's a 2-hour video. It's worth every minute. This is the explanation as to what happened, and it's pages. And I think it reads a little bit more like a nice, exciting narrative. It is my memories of the events, pretty close to the time that they occurred when I first wrote them down, and have verified a number of these things after the fact with other sources. And a year later, 1 year after the Deaf President Now protests, well, 1 year and 4 more months. So Deaf President Now is March of '88. Okay, think about this. March 1988. It's a presidential election year. We're in Washington, D.C. And we're screaming, Deaf President Now. And people are thinking, I thought we had one. Isn't that Ronald Reagan? Isn't he hard of hearing? Isn't he deaf? So George H.W. Bush, running for president. You have Jesse Jackson running for president. You have a number of other people, famous people, well, famous people because they're politicians, running for president. And we're saying deaf president now. So a lot of people in D.C. were confused about, why do we want a deaf president? Oh, for that deaf college. Oh, yeah. Well, okay, that's fine. Well, they can have a deaf president. But we were having a nomination, you know, we're going to choose another president. At the Omni Charm Hotel in Northeast D.C. and at other locations throughout D.C., including Gallaudet's campus, we have the Deaf Way. And there's a video that supports the Deaf Way that you should look at. It's a Deaf Mosaic video. It's a fantastic overview, snapshot of all kinds of things going on there. Deaf people in charge of having their own events, doing their own things. We got to move on. And so we have deaf people creating a communication workaround, right? If Alexander Graham Bell is going to invent the phone, thinking he's going to help deaf people, and ends up being one of the biggest barriers deaf people have ever had. Robert Whitebrecht, an engineer, in 1964, invents the acoustic coupler. And what does that do? It lets him use the telephone line to transmit essentially the beeps and whirs that you would think of when well, you're now probably not old enough to remember dial-up services, where you had to put the phone on the modem and it would, okay, and it would communicate with another modem on the other phone. Okay, this is the same kind of thing, except you were using old teletype machines, like big bulky teletype machines, like you see in some old movies about newspaper, constantly typing on big rolls of paper, and that's what you had. You had big rolls of paper and a few machines, and you'd have one at the deaf club, and if you were an important player in the deaf community, you might have one in your house. But they weren't necessarily given away for free, so you had people going to junkyards and rehabbing these machines that had long ago been replaced by more efficient, smaller equipment. And then eventually, within a few years, you had people creating the smaller devices that you will see in the Ernest Marshall video. Shows a little bit about closed captioning and teletype devices for the deaf. Okay, so closed captioning. So in 1971, television became more accessible when the Caption Center at WBGH in Boston began running open captions. Right, you can't turn them off. On Julia Child's French Chef show, So you could learn how to cook and read at the same time. And after a while, people said, you know what, is there a way we can not have to have the captions on? Which I find is so ridiculous because people get used to them, and does it really hurt to have the captions on at all? Could we have all of the captions on in all the bars in America and all of the places where you don't have the sound on anyway? Just turn the captioning on, okay? Because it's kind of similar to watch the news. You can read the ticker on the bottom, the banners every once in a while, but you don't know what anybody's saying. Well, they're all captioned. All these shows are captioned, so you can turn on the captioning. But anyway, so back in the day, we had Line 21 closed captioning, which actually is still the captioning technology that we use today. And you had a decoder. And Line 21 at the time was the line right above the video signal. So if we're looking at this and pretending that that's your TV, your old school TV with horizontal and vertical hold, you don't even know what I'm talking about. So you have 21 lines of information at the top, and on the 22nd line would be the first lines of color. There's some green, there's some green, there's this, whatever that color is, and some kind of white. And then line 23, 24, 25. Okay, so lines 1 through 20 had information about the size of the screen, the rate of the screen refreshing, I guess. I don't know what it has in there. Sound information. Audio, yawn track, and line 21 then was reserved for captioning information, which is important because if you put other information in there, it'll screw up the captioning. So only captioning information can go in there. It has to be encoded the way the captioning is encoded, but you got a whole line of information that refreshes at least once every, or 30 times every second. Right, 30 times every second. Maybe 60 times per second. I don't know how frequently it refreshed. Probably 30 times a second. Okay, so what do you do with that information? Well, you have a coded information that says here's where the letters appear and in what order, and then you have a decoder that imposes those letters over top of the image that you're looking at. And so you might have caption that's just at the bottom and is running like a continual ticker. Or you might have caption that shows up over here where character A is and shows up over here where character B is. And all that information is encoded in line 21 of your regular television broadcast. Or at least it used to be before we went digital. I haven't any idea if there is such a thing as lines in a digital broadcast. I'm looking at the history, not worried about the current version because the current version figured it out. Great. So that was closed captioning, but you had to have a decoder device. However, it did mean that on Sunday night, the ABC Sunday Night Movie, you could finally see that movie that was released 5 years ago and understand it this time because it's got captions. So Star Wars comes out, and 5 years later, on the Sunday Night Movie, you can actually understand what Han Solo is saying. Okay, and then we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. So 10 years after we have the decoder, we have two pieces of legislation in the same year, the second of which relates to the Decoder Circuitry Act. That, after 10 years, that's probably the fastest turnaround of introducing something and then saying, that's working, let's go with it. The Television Decoder Circuitry Act said, you know what, you make TVs in the country, you sell TVs in the country. There weren't a lot of, I think there was one manufacturer of televisions still working in the U.S., and they went out of business soon enough after that. You sell TVs in the United States, they have to have built-in captioning ability. So we don't have to have the separate decoder anymore that you have to buy. You just buy the TV, you got to get the decoder. So you go to use the TV in a hotel room, that's all you got. You don't have to bring your decoder with you. You can just, with the menu control, find the decoding. Want to watch captioning in the bar or in the restaurant, every TV that's sold after 1993, you have to give 3 years for the act to take place, and then you just got, if it's a screen of any useful size, right? If it's a screen on your wrist, it doesn't have to have the captioning. But if it's a screen of 13 inches or more, which everything's, come on, 77-inch TVs, so those have to have captioning. Immediately prior to that? Yeah, so on July 26th, I think the Decoder Circuitry Act was October. So the ADA, in the middle of the year, passes. And that was a lot of work. I actually was involved in interpreting for some of the committees for that prior to the passage of the law. And I think some stuff on the follow-up afterwards. 1990. Well, no, it must have been all follow-up. because I wasn't certified until the end of '90, and therefore I wouldn't have been working with the agencies yet. Okay, never mind. But I worked with a lot of people who did the ADA. I just they had already passed the ADA at this point. And so, what's the ADA say? Well, the ADA does a lot of things, and it doesn't just affect deaf people, but it's a major player in how deaf people are able to get things done. So, it had an impact on telecommunications. You had to have 911 TTY accessibility. That means if a deaf person called 911, the 911 centers had to be able to respond to typing on your little device that and let you know that we understand you, we understand your request, you need an ambulance, your something's on fire, you've been robbed, whatever it is, and send appropriate services to you. We had telephone relay services. Every state was required to have a relay service based on the TTY. This is all kind of moot now because not a lot of people use TTYs with the days of video conferencing, video phone stuff. Public phone banks had to have a TTY for every 8th phone. You had to have one that was accessible with TTY. What did that have the effect of doing? Come on, you can guess. That's right. They got rid of 8 phone banks. They only went up to 7. So they never had to provide the TTY one. Yeah, so much for the 50 phone bank, right? Pay phones, 50. Shortly thereafter, everybody's got the phone with them anyway. Go try to find a public phone anymore. But at the time, you would find in hotels, some fancy bigger hotels, and in airports, a whole bunch of phones, right? They'd bring a main trunk line for the phone service, and you'd have 48 payphones or 75 payphones. Well, the idea was every 8th payphone needed to have a TTY device built in and accessible. And some places conformed and complied with that, and a lot of places just said, rip out the phone banks. We're just going to put 7 phones here, we'll put another 7 phones in another place, another 7 phones in another place. We'll keep the same number of phones in the airport. We just won't put them all in the same place. And we only have to put maybe 1 or 2 TTYs in the whole building. That's become moot now because we use the video phones. We don't have to. Hotels had to have TVs, TTYs, captioning devices. You could buy a kit. That you let them know I'm deaf. Every hotel probably had one kit. So this became a problem if you had a conference like the National Association of the Deaf, and you have hundreds of people who are deaf coming and staying at a hotel. Okay, we got one kit. So they might have to make some other accommodations. But it got better, and it's significantly better now since all the TVs have captioning built in, and we don't need TTYs anymore. And a lot of people have their own signaling devices, and a lot of this stuff ends up not being such an important thing. The biggest thing that remains on top of all of this that the ADA empowers deaf people with is I have a right to an interpreter. And that right is based on my ability to access things on the same terms as anybody else could. So if you're a business open to the public, I have a right to access whatever you provide. Now, that doesn't mean I need an interpreter all the time, right? So if you have a restaurant and there is a menu, printed menu would be good. That would be reasonable accommodation, and that's not too hard to accommodate since most places already have a printed menu. But if you have a play, I have a right to understand the play, and therefore, if I give you advance notice, you need to accommodate me by having interpreting services for the play that I've bought tickets for. I still need to buy my tickets. I don't deserve to go for free, but it's going to cost you more to hire the interpreters than it costs me to buy the ticket. You can't charge me that fee in my ticket purchase. That has to be accommodated by the organization. I have a right to go to the doctor and understand what my doctor is telling me and what my prognosis is and how I should care for myself. So yes, it will cost more for the interpreter than the doctor gets charging me for the office visit. But I can't be charged for the interpreter on top. You can't charge my insurance for the interpreter. You have to take if that's going to cost you $200 every other month to have interpreting services, then you need to plan for, would it be an extra $1,200 of expenses? So everybody's office visit is going to cost $1 more, or $2 more, whatever it ends up being. Or these services have an extra fee involved. But it's for everybody, and not just the deaf person has to pay that. So that's the biggest effect that the ADA had, was a matter of have the right to have an interpreter. Here's the funny little thing that happened. Of course, I was in Washington, D.C. area when this passed, and suddenly a lot of federal employees were requesting that their agencies provide interpreting services for their meetings. Federal agencies. The Section 504 from 1973 Rehabilitation Act already required that. So they had been not accessing their rights for about 20 years. When the ADA passed, people became aware of their rights and started asking for interpreting services. But the ADA didn't apply to the federal government. Section 504 did. And so places that had had a 20-year, I was going to say, gimme for 20 years, suddenly had to start providing services. And good, and they did. Talking about Dakota, there it is, October 1990. So we have the captioned TVs. So, there you go. Core membership in the deaf community. Are we still in Unit 5? Okay. So these are elements that identify you as being peripherally, centrally, or reasonably in the middle of the deaf community. So if you have the more of these you have, the more of a core member you are. Did you go to school at a residential school for deaf children? That's a plus if you did. Are your parents deaf? Oh my goodness, plus, plus, double plus. Are you ideologically deaf, or are you hard of hearing? So you really are deaf? Okay, good. Are you politically activating for deaf people? You know, yay, deaf power, right? Okay. Or, no, I don't care. Okay, so if you're active and engaged with the deaf community, then you're even further into the core. Do you use ASL fluently? Like, is that your key language? Yep. And are you socially active with deaf people? If you got all 6 of those, we would say, wow, center of the deaf community, no questions asked. And if you have some of those, then you get to be a little bit more peripherally on the outside. So, all you hearing people, you go to school for the deaf? No. Do you have deaf parents? Maybe you do. Are you ideologically deaf? No. Are you politically advocating for deaf people? Maybe you are. Do we suspect you, or are you doing the right things? Are you a fluent ASL user? Okay. Are you socially active with deaf people? So hearing people, interpreters, can hit a lot of these things. They wouldn't be in the core, but you are potentially in the deaf community. Be aware of those things. Don't abuse the power, because there is power associated with politically advocating for deaf people. Keep in mind that you don't represent the deaf people. You can speak to their desires, but it's best if the deaf person says what they want and you interpret what they want. So there we go. That's finally, well, this has been a long one. That's chapter 5, and lots of videos for you to watch. A good 6 or 7 hours plus the films outright. Worth doing to get a full sense of this. This is the most important aspect, I would say, of the deaf community, is they can do for themselves just fine. Look at how many ways. And then the next chapter, we're going to look at interpreting specifically. So, see ya on the next one.